Okay, let's take a closer look at this online movement. And joining us, Remy Piet. Remy's a senior partner at Embelli Advisory. Remy, welcome back. Good to see you. This is an interesting topic, and make no question, it is a power play. And considering Latinos have spending power some $2.5 trillion each year, trillion with a T, what is it going to take to make this movement a success?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to try to see what could be the actual impact economically of a change of behavior from a large part of the population. Latinos represent 20% of the U.S. population, and actually some of the most spending segments of the population, especially on some of the companies that have scaled back DEI, as you were mentioning. They want to make a point about the fact that these movements about more diversity and inclusion was actually something for the better for the American society. They're not actually the only ones moving forward onto those movements. There's also an economic spending blackout that's been called for February 28 by non-Latinos that were actually also trying to raise concerns about the rise of prices across the board in the U.S., from gas to eggs to milk. A series of the protectionist measures from the Trump administration are already starting to hit the middle consumers and middle classes.
Okay, so the big thing is making this a trend, not a fad. And in the past, we've seen these things take off great out of the box and then tend to fizzle out. What do you think about this? What is it going to take to make this Latino freeze out a success?
No, you're absolutely right. The question is whether or not this would be effective or just a one day or a couple of days. It really depends on the resilience from people trying to follow this movement. The fact that the calls for this movement are not only about the change of diversity inclusion measures that were pushed by the Biden administration and completely scaled back by the Trump administration with a series of lawsuits, is also doubled by a series of criticism on policies of deportation from migrants and so on. So for people that don't have a lot of capacities of expression and try to make a dent into the Trump administration agenda, their change of habits of consumption is probably the best weapon that they have in their hands. But obviously, if this just lasts a couple of days, this will just be a short wave. If it's actually something that is more resilient and more structural into the American society, that might actually have a strong impact in terms of the economic well-being of a series of the states, and maybe have an influence on stopping the scaling back of DEI measures and some of the most extreme measures from the Trump administration.
Now, DEI rollbacks may be hurting some companies a lot more than others, and there are now some reports that Target saw less foot traffic in its stores since the announcement that it was rolling back its DEI measures. So just how big of a financial impact could this have on a company, or do you think the reports could be possibly overblown at this point?
So it very much depends on the company itself. You do have companies that continue with DEI, such as you have Delta Airlines, for example. Apple, Microsoft still have some DEI policies in place, and that haven't been changed. In the case of Target, it's a very interesting case. Target has scaled back its DEI policies. It's also been the target of a series of lawsuits, especially from Trump supporters, because DEI was really at the core of the values of Target, and it has positioned itself as some kind of a brand that people would welcome spending a little more. And on the other side, they would actually support policies and a vision from a brand that would actually include more diversification, more equity into its measures. So the fact that they scale back on this has really led to the classic consumers of Target to move away from the stores, because that was one of the main motivation to agree to pay a little more for some of the products against some more inclusive policies.
Now, you talked about that nationwide boycott for the end of the month, and companies such as Amazon, Walmart, Best Buy have been targeted. Now, the list of companies and brands rolling back DEI, for the most part, only seems to be growing, and a popular alternative to Coke and Pepsi joined the rollback a week ago. Now, Citigroup as well. So is this a sign that perhaps major companies just don't care what a massively frustrated part of the United States believes?
I think it's mainly a question of risk mitigation here. There was a strong encouragement for the Biden administration, obviously, to foster those question diversity, which probably in the long term was also a good strategy for different brands to include the views of more different people, be able to address different market segments, understand better the needs from their consumers by having a larger representative sample of their employees from kind of this basic consumer base that they were targeting. But here, in terms of risk mitigation, I'm mentioning this because clearly the DEI agenda has been heavily criticized by the Trump administration, calling it a wokeist agenda, but it's also been doubled by a series of lawsuits reaffirmed by political establishment in a varieties of red states. So for those brands, it's really a kind of mitigate potential financial strains that would be the results of lawsuits from a series of mega supporters.
Target and Starbucks have been targeted by lawsuits for their DEI policies in the wake of all this backlash. Do you expect to see other lawsuits to be filed? And what about lawsuits for companies' rollback of these policies?
I mean, there will be a series of different lawsuits because it's part of weapons in hands of MAGA supporters. Whether they're successful or not, and whether the time they will actually take for those lawsuits to bear any kind of significance, actually, is still to be seen. But the question is a question of reputational risk for those brands, and who they're trying to address in terms of their customers. We've seen some brands still hold strong on DEI because they actually believe it's part of their core value. But those that actually are more, let's say, flaky into their strategy, have been going from supporting DEI for probably bad reasons under the bad administration to then becoming most of a leading the herd about scaling back simply to please the Trump administration and trying to avoid big headlines in newspaper. Well, now the question is whether or not some of the consumers will actually try to focus their consumer behavior as one of their main political actions in between elections, and will actually strongly favor structurally the brands that actually focus on whether in favor of the AI or against, whether they're very faithful to those brands and not just on pricing signals. So it's going to be very interesting to see the impact of this movement at the end of this month, February 28, just for both for the Latino freeze and for the movement against inflation, and seeing this actually carries on throughout March and has actually an impact on the strategies from the companies themselves.